Greetings to all. Welcome to CEC lecture. The topic of analysis is historical context of modern government. In this lecture we shall attempt to explain the historical context of the idea of modern government. This lecture, while deliberating on the historical context of modern government, shall also analyze it from looking at the nature and scope of political science, the study of power, types of government, important historical events. This lecture shall be of great use for the learners from the discipline of political science, international relations, comparative political analysis, political theory, amongst others. To begin with, Harold D. Laswell and Abraham Kaplan defined political science as the study of shaping and sharing of power. Now, this definition by Harold D. Laswell and Abraham Kaplan has an important bearing with respect to issues concerning governance and government thereof. Now, politics, as we all know, it's a broad activity. Politics implies both state activity as well as politics would look at power dynamics also. So, political science then looks at this process of politics, that is, study of the state and power in all their aspects. Now, when we talk about the term state is different from the term government, and this is very important as we try to understand the historical context of modern day government. The term state in its modern sense was first used by Niccolò Machiavelli, the Italian philosopher. And since then, the study of state has remained a very important focal point for the study of political science for the purpose of research and analysis by the political scientists. Now, when we understand the concept of state, the state consists of four elements. What are these four elements? The people. Second, the territory on which they live. Third, government to rule and regulate the lives of people. And fourth, sovereignty. Sovereignty, which implies unrestricted authority to take decisions and manage its own affairs. So, when we look at the concept of state, this now has a special bearing with respect to the government. Now, what do you mean by government? Government is the most important instrument of the state through which the latter realizes its objective. Quoting this very popular definition that we got through our Google search. Further, when we just discuss the nature of political science, so the subject of political science often is understood as specialized science of the state. So, therefore, political science studies different forms of government, the organs of government, namely legislature, executive, judiciary. Further, when we talk about the subject of political science, its scope also overlaps with not only understanding the role of the state, but also looking at functions of the government and its relationship to the citizens. Now, as we all know that the role and nature of the state have been interpreted differently. There are various theories of the state to account for the origin of the state. There are various theories of the state to define the mandate of the state. In the similar perspective, the role of governments also have been interpreted differently. In the same light, the idea of government also, its important role has been understood in a different sphere. Now, this role of government in a different perspective is very essential once again to deliberate on the historical context of the modern government. Now, let's go to some important perspectives that we get from history. The ancient Greeks, they thought of political science in the nature of grand theorizing, which is often looked as political philosophy. They laid stress on the ethical aspects of politics. And what were they? in modern times, as contrast to that, what we see here is political science then acquires a realistic approach. So therefore, it is essential to factor in the historical evolution, the transition from the ancient Greek perspective of looking at the ethical aspects of politics to the modern science where political science acquires a realistic approach, that it is essential to be factored in for the historical evolution of the concept of government. Now, as we understand the term government, we know that it is one of the most important political institutions. It is defined and understood as system or group of people governing an organized community, generally a state. And when we look at it in an associative sense, government consists of legislature to make laws, executive to implement laws, and judiciary to judge between the laws. So what we see here is that government, it implies, quoting this very important definition that we got from merriam-webster.com, that is, government is body of persons that constitutes the governing authority of a political unit or organization. Further, government is territorially based body that makes authoritative decisions for which it has constitutional or legislative authority that are binding on residents and businesses within its boundaries. Now, when we look at the historical aspect, when we try to understand that how the largest social groups earlier were the tribes or the villages. So, the pre-political form of social organization, which one finds the rise of agriculture, which one finds that how it led to rise of civilizations. In this aspect, government was situated within the aspect of a pre-political form of social organization, namely the tribal chiefs, or what we can say monarchical aspect. The idea of monarchy as a government implies that total sovereignty is invested in one person, a head of state called as monarch. Now, monarchy as a form of government has existed since the earliest history of humankind. An example of monarchy is rise of monarchical government corresponding to the Neolithic or the farming revolution. How during that time the tribal chiefs, the chieftains, the social forms of organizations were the important apparatus through which the government perspective was seen. Then one finds that in the Greek city-states, when we look at important examples from history, we quoting some important examples that we got from worldhistory.com, that is, in some Greek city-states, there was direct democracy. And what is this direct democracy? All citizens could participate. An example of that, Athens. Some had monarchy. An example of that, Sparta. Others had oligarchy, where a small powerful group led the government. Example of that, Thebes. And others had a single leader or tyrant. An example of that, Syracuse. So what we see here is, when we try to understand government through the Greek city-states, each city-state was, on one hand, economic, cultural organization, and on the other hand, it was a self-governing community. Now, it is very essential to understand, looking at modern government in a historical context, that the city of Athens invented the government of democracy, and it was the example of direct democracy. Now, direct democracy, it was beneficial as a purest form of governing structure. And most important, with limited population, giving people an absolute superiority and automatic sovereignty over representative government, to quote from the important work of Magalbai, direct democracy was a unique experiment and example when we try to understand the idea of government through the Greek city-states. But further, as time evolved, as civilization progressed, as human evolution took place, there were certain disadvantages also. It was not suitable when a society becomes too large, or that it is difficult to keep track of all the votes or to find a common ground amongst the people. In such complex, so therefore with the rise of complexity in the working of human civilization, direct democracy was not a viable form of government apparatus to take things forward. Now we all know that how the idea of government apparatus has been looked upon through philosophical theorization also. An example here, Plato's philosopher king, wherein that is philosophers would be the best rulers of society because they are able to understand true goodness and justice in a way that other people cannot. Further, the idea of philosopher king was a hypothetical ruler in whom political skill is combined with philosophical knowledge. So therefore the city-state ruled by philosophers in Plato's Republic is a very important concept to deliberate on when we look at the ethical theorization of the government in the ancient time. Further, the government as an apparatus has been classified in the ancient times, and an important work here is that of Aristotle. Now, as per Aristotle's classification of number, as we all know, the idea of government implies rule. The idea of government implies working for the people. So therefore, if it is the rule of one, then it would be monarchy or kingship, that is an ideal form of government. Or it would be despotism or tyranny in a perverted form. In the same light, if the rule is by few, then it would be aristocracy as an ideal form of government or oligarchy in a perverted form. Further, if the rule is by many, it would be polity or constitutional government as the ideal form of government, and democracy, very essential to understand, in the Greek city times, in the work of Aristotle, was looked upon as the perverted form. So according to Aristotle, that is, without adequate checks to rulers' power, no form of government would be stable. He believed that power and virtue cannot coexist. Now, what is essential here is that the idea of democracy, that is, ruled by citizens of the monarchy, ruled by an individual who has inherited power, oligarchy, ruled by a select group of powerful or wealthy individuals, tyranny, ruled by an individual who has seized power by force. In all these aspects, democracy, monarchy, oligarchy, tyranny, the apparatus of government has worked. In some countries it has worked, whereas in other countries it is questioned. But as we see from the example of the Greek city-states to in present times, government as a pillar of the state, it could coexist in any of these forms, from democracy to monarchy to oligarchy to tyranny. But when we look at the historical context, it is very essential to understand that things have come a long way for the apparatus of the government as an arm of the state. That is, today, liberal democracy, wherein there is rule by the people, is accepted as the most important as feature or perspective on the government. Now, similarly, when we understand the historical perspective, another important perspective we get from Rome. Now, Rome is an important example of the strongest state in the Mediterranean. So, Romans established a form of government that was republic. And republic, that is government in which citizens elected representatives to rule on their behalf. But what happens here is that the aristocracy, the wealthy class, they dominated the early Roman Republic. In Roman society, the aristocrats were known as patricians, where that is the highest positions in the government were held by two councils or the leaders who ruled the Roman Republic. So today what we see here is that from the Greek city-states to the Roman Empire, the most accepted form of government is that of a liberal democracy. And what we see here is that over the period of time too, the functions of government have increased. Today, there is a vast range of functions wherein which one looks at the scope of government. The primary responsibility of the government is to maintain law and order, to look after welfare, and also at the same time it is the means by which state policy is enforced. So therein comes an important link between government and the state, that to get the state policy going, government is the most crucial extension. Now, as we understand the historical context of government, modern day capitalism played a very important role. Now, we all know that trade, exchange has always existed in human civilization. Earlier, there was barter system, but the industrial form of capitalism developed in England in the 18th century, followed by the commercial mercantile revolution in Western Europe in the 16th century. So, all this has to be seen that how the industrial revolution coming after the mercantile revolution, coming after the collapse of feudalism, coming with the establishment of capitalism as an important economic system, the focus gets towards the new form of government apparatus, and therein liberal democracy was seen as a very important viable alternative. Seen in this light, Max Weber's work on capitalism somewhere explains that how capitalism was very integral to the needs of that time in order to understand that how industrial revolution required a new ethic. Max Weber, the German sociologist, in his book The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, opines that how capitalism was an inescapable consequence of Europe's historical development. So, therefore, the modern government also, when we try to understand the historical perspective, this one has to factor in. That is how the Protestant, that mainly the Calvinistic ethic influenced large number of people to engage in work, develop their own enterprise, engage in trade. So, one what finds here is that the historical context to define the modern government is indeed a vast panorama. It has lots of inputs and perspectives. Similarly, as we understand the idea of modern state with sovereignty, wherein government plays an important role to voice out that sovereignty, the Peace of Westphalia 1648, it was the first unique treaty, the Treaty of Westphalia, that recognized the full territorial sovereignty of the member states or the nation states of the empire. Similarly, when we talk about the historical context of the modern government, the French Declaration of Rights of Man 1789 also presents some important inputs that in the present times they guide the working of the government. Separation of power, rights of freedom, rights of speech, ideas of liberty amongst others. Article 1 of the French Declaration of Rights of Men, that is, all men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Article 2 of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, that is, rights of liberty, private property, inviolability of the person, and resistance to oppression. All of them today are very important components for understanding the present day government, where liberal democracy is seen as a very important idea to guide the working of the government. Further, the Article 5, that is, law can only prohibit such actions that are harmful to society. Article 6 of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man 1789, that law is the expression of general will. All of them today have an important bearing on the working of functions of various organs of the government. Further, another important historical event that we must understand while looking at the historical context of modern government, the American Declaration of Independence, that how it allowed for recognition of United States by friendly foreign countries, and it was the first formal statement by a nation's people asserting their right to choose their own government. So, one what gets here that how the historical context of the modern government driven by capitalism, liberal democracy has very important inputs from French Declaration of Rights of Man to American Declaration of Independence. John Locke, the English philosopher, he presented the idea of natural rights as inalienable rights of man, that is, life, liberty and property. John Locke believed that the most basic human law of nature is preservation of mankind. And this idea of the need to be secure, the idea of government being based on consent, today is an important aspect concerning the functioning of the government. Jeremy Bentham's perspective on utilitarianism, that is maximization of pleasure, with his defense of representative politics, that is greatest happiness of the greatest number, that is measure of right and wrong, and the obligation to minister to general happiness, all of them are of paramount importance. And this is why even today, when we try to understand the welfare function of the government, Bentham's defense of representative politics is an important perspective to deliberate on. J.S. Mill's work on championing suffrage for women, 1869, that is the important work Subjection of Women, the essay by the philosopher and political economist John Stuart Mill, wherein the argument was in favor of legal and social equality between men and women. So today, when we try to understand the idea of how the government must work towards an inclusive approach, all these perspectives are important to factor in. Further, Spirit of Laws, the work by Montesquieu, it pleaded in favor of constitutional system of government, separation of power, preservation of civil liberties and the laws. So what we see here is that government is indeed a very important pillar of the state. Government is an important aspect. It's a body of people to constitute the governing authority of the state. Further, as a system or group of people to govern a state with its entire apparatus of legislature, executive and judiciary. When we try to look at the historical context of the modern government, the historical context of modern government needs to be seen that how the study of the scope of political science has indeed increased over time. It has been broadened over the time, wherein we look at state and we also look at the power dynamics in all their aspect. And in all this, government have an important aspect, important role with respect to ruling and regulating the lives of people. Over the history from Greek city-states to the Roman Empire, to the rise of capitalism or to the present time wherein liberal democracy is seen as the most accepted model of government, indeed there are a lot of variations, lot of interpretations with respect to nature, structure and functions of the government. Dear learners, we hope that the lecture on the historical context of modern government presented to you significant inputs and insights to prepare for your answers and examinations. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all. Thank you very much.